You're listening to the Options Insider Radio Network, the home of the Options Podcast. For more quality options programs, visit theoptionsinsider.com or search for Options Insider Radio Network in your podcast provider of choice. Listeners can also access all of our programming through our mobile app available in the iTunes and Google Play stores. Select programs are also available via live stream at mixlr.com/options-insider. That's mixlr.com/options-insider. Don't forget to follow along with your favorite programs and submit your own questions for the hosts at twitter.com/options, stocktwits.com/options, facebook.com/theoptionsinsider, or via questions at theoptionsinsider.com. Bitcoin, Ether, Ripple, Litecoin, and more. Cryptocurrencies and other digital assets are taking the financial world by storm. This exploding market provides everything a savvy trader needs: volatility, volume, and liquidity. Provided you know how to find it. That's where we come in. Welcome to the Crypto Rundown. Each week, we'll break down the latest trading activity, trends, and developments on everything from coins to tokens, futures, and even OTC options. If it's moving the crypto markets, then you'll find it on the Crypto Rundown. Now it's time to dive into the exploding world of cryptocurrencies and digital assets. It's time for the Crypto Rundown.
All right, everybody. That music means it is time once again for the Crypto Rundown, the program here on the Options Insider Radio Network, where we go beyond our traditional stomping grounds of equity options and all that good stuff and get into the vol and the SKEW and all the good stuff on the crypto side of the fence. We're going to talk the derivatives, also going to talk some of the spot and some of the futures and the options, all the good stuff kind of rolled into one. My name is Mark Longo. I will be your host, your guide, your maitre d' for this foray into the world of all things crypto derivatives. And we've got a great guest lined up on the hot seat. Let's not keep them waiting.
Forget about cold storage. It's time to turn up the heat on thought leaders from the world of cryptocurrencies and digital assets. It's time to take their place on the Crypto Hot Seat.
All right, everybody, welcome to the Crypto Hot Seat, the portion of the show where we welcome on guests from throughout the world of crypto derivatives and indeed beyond, and proceed to pick their brains for the benefit of you, the listener. Next up on the program is a newcomer to the hot seat and indeed to the network. He is Josh Lim, the head of derivatives at Genesis Trading. Josh, welcome to the Crypto Rundown program.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm really glad to be here.
All right, Josh, as we are wont to do with all of our first-timers here on the network, why don't you go ahead and give our audience a little bit of an overview of your background in the trading world and how you found your way to starting up the crypto desk over there at Genesis Trading.
Yeah, certainly. So like a lot of people in the crypto world, I'm sort of a refugee from traditional markets. I started off in equity derivatives, worked at an investment bank, going through like the typical analyst program. And I was more focused really on like the exotic side of the derivatives world. So pricing things that are pretty much, traded OTC. A lot of what we were doing was with hedge funds and, larger institutional clients, and then hedging that off in kind of the listed markets. So that was sort of my focus for a couple of years. And then I discovered crypto in 2014. And I worked at a company called Circle, which was sort of a big on-ramp for a lot of retail guys to start investing and trading crypto. And I was doing that for about 3 years. And then, one of the things that I was sort of in charge of there was building out basically like a treasury operation, sort of think like a corporate treasury, corporate FX desk, managing a lot of the retail flow that we had for the business. And it turned out to source a lot of the crypto that we were ultimately selling to our retail users, we had to really interface with larger sort of suppliers of crypto, like miners, larger sort of trading desks, early investors that accumulated a lot of crypto. And that's how it kind of grew to become a much more full functional OTC desk, and really sort of a franchise and customer facing business. And so I've done that kind of ever since, on increasingly larger scale, I'd say, especially as the market has grown. The set of counterparties has become more sophisticated and more institutional. And now it kind of feels like I'm back in kind of my old seat. So it's like, a lot of really professional investors now are trading crypto. And we face a lot of them in my seat here as an OTC, bilateral OTC trading counterparty, whether it's options or forwards or sometimes more sophisticated things.
And give us a little bit of an overview of Genesis. You're the first Genesis rep here on the network.
Yeah. So Genesis is, before it became kind of a full crypto shop, was really involved in more esoteric fixed income instruments. It was a firm called Second Market for a while. So I think one of its hallmarks was dealing in sort of auction rate securities. Its founder, Barry Silbert, has been very involved in the crypto space since the beginning, 2012, 2013. He started a company called Digital Currency Group, which is more involved in principal investing, venture investing across the space, equity and tokens. And then it owns a couple of kind of fully owned subsidiaries under the DCG umbrella. Genesis Trading is one of them. Probably a couple other larger firms, if you're familiar with crypto, that you might know, like CoinDesk, which is a media arm. Grayscale, which is the largest asset manager in crypto, sponsors a couple of the sort of the trust products that are traded on the OTC QX markets. I think Genesis Trading, started as primarily like a spot OTC trading shop. So we were sort of a high touch firm. A lot of people came to us to trade large blocks of risk, whether it was Bitcoin, ETH, or, further down the kind of smaller end of the market cap spectrum. And then over time, as the things that our counterparties asked for became more sophisticated, we grew to become more, basically the largest lender in the crypto space. And lender, I mean sort of provider of financing, provider of sort of even what you might think of as like a securities lending business. So providing people the ability to short Bitcoin, ETH, other alts, and source borrows on those names from our desk. And so right now, I think we're certainly one of the bigger ones out there, if not the biggest. With I think our loan book is around like $1.5 billion in notional. So and then now kind of on top of all of that, is sort of building a derivatives business, right? So there's certainly all the pieces in place, a good balance sheet, a lot of sort of trading expertise and connectivity to people in the space, a lot of bilateral relationships, and we've obviously built a lot of credibility with people in terms of facing us and our counterparty exposure. So it's been a sort of a long road from the beginning till now, but putting all the pieces in place to build a real derivatives business has been fun.
Well, let's talk about that derivatives business a little bit, because it has been an interesting space to watch. Obviously, that's our core focus here on this program, and we've seen a huge amount of evolution in that space just since we launched this show, January of last year. So it's been about a year and a half. And when we first started this show, obviously Deribit was putting up some paper, but the lion's share of the stuff on the options front was really going up on the OTC side. That was where you saw a lot of the big institutional paper going up. And even still, it was few and far between. And since then, of course, we've seen CME get into the game, kind of like a whimper at first, and now starting to do some decent paper, maybe last week or so, not so much, but we'll get to all that in the Bitcoin breakdown in a little bit. But still, in general, we've seen these new venues start to come online. Deribit obviously doing more paper out there, OKEX and others starting to do more flow. So in general, it's just a much larger market than it was even when we started this show a year and a half ago. Is that what brought you guys at Genesis to the table? Is that what made them decide this was the time to dive into the crypto derivatives fray? It's just the market had reached that saturation point where it was time and a desk was a viable thing?
Yeah, I think you've kind of hit the nail on the head. It's, the market's become big enough to really sustain like an institutional sort of sell side, desk, right? Like there's enough people out there, enough hedge funds, enough corporates that are, have hedging needs, have needs to express very specific, catalyst-driven views, that it makes sense to offer this as an OTC product. And it's not, the liquidity that you can find on Deribit, or even the screen liquidity you can find on CME sometimes just isn't enough to fill a large size order. And you kind of have to do, you do have to negotiate with liquidity providers to get the size that you want. So, and not only that, but, there are people that in the space that are coming at this from very different perspectives, right? Like if you work at a bank, you're trading with hedge funds and buy side people that understand your market and understand finance and know what options are. But in the crypto world, oftentimes you're dealing with people that came into the space through different avenues, not through traditional finance, and don't necessarily have derivatives background. So a lot of what we do is education and sort of, helping people understand, there are more things you can do against your, crypto denominated cash flows than, just selling into the spot market every day or, hedging with perpetual swaps on BitMEX or whatever. There's more things out there. There's more instruments that might be useful to you.
Well, you mentioned that institutional audience. That's always been an audience of interest to us here on the program because it kind of ebbs and flows and they have interesting and unique needs, interesting, unique viewpoints on the space. I'm curious, that's a lot of the flow you interact with over there. Walk us through what the past few months have been like over there, what you're seeing on the institutional interest and order flow side. Obviously, we've seen a pretty interesting, leading into the halving of Bitcoin, we saw a lot of interesting flow. Then things kind of quieted down quite a bit. Bitcoin kind of range bound, vol coming in quite a bit. And then spoiler alert for later listeners, it's off to the races yet again. Bitcoin up almost 10% today. So we've seen a nice little upswing recently out there as well. What have the last few months been like from a institutional interest in crypto derivatives? Are they coming in? Are they looking to gobble up upside? Are they speculating to the upside? Are they looking to hedge? Are they looking to generate income? What kind of flow have you been seeing over there?
Yeah. I mean, it's almost a mix of everything you described. I mean, I'd say the narrative, right, over the last couple of months has been, obviously a lot of people were positioning long crypto, whether it was the majors like Bitcoin, ETH, or the alts going into the halving, right? I think even at the start of the year, people were generally positioned bullish. And, across the board, right, risk assets were kind of rallying, NASDAQ and everything was kind of hitting highs. And then March happened, and that caught a lot of people off sides. And I think more so in the crypto world because crypto people have this sort of sense that hey, crypto really should decouple and outperform in a macro crisis. And, that doesn't really happen, right, in reality, because in reality, crypto is a risk asset like everything else. So it gets sold and liquidated for cash when there's cash needs. So, so I think March happened. I think, the people who survived that sort of crash accumulated a lot of coins, at very good levels, right? So, in the $4,000, $5,000 range per Bitcoin. And what we basically saw the narrative kind of coming out of March was the long holders looking to trim risk, right? And the way that made sense at that time with vols kind of holding pretty firm, right, 90, 100 vol across the curve, was to do sort of overriding trades. And that had always been a theme, but because vols had firmed up so dramatically in that sell-off, a lot of people started looking more seriously at these sort of overriding strategies and became much more prevalent since March, April, May. Sort of May was the start where Bitcoin kind of settled into its range that it's been in the last 3 months before this sort of gap move higher just in the last few days. So, in this sort of macro environment where everything else was sort of recovering, all risk assets were recovering, Bitcoin was, stuck in this range between 9 and 10, the overriders really drove the flows. And it was really the first time that, options-related positioning in the market really drove how spot behaved, right? Behaved. So you kind of saw a lot of moves outside of the range or, sort of gap moves up and down get bought and sold respectively by options dealers to delta hedge their book. So, everyone was kind of long gamma and people were delta hedging, and that's why you had such a muted range for a while. And I think now what you're seeing, especially in the last few days, I think Bitcoin, especially with some of the bigger headlines that have hit the tape recently, right? You've got the news with the OCC sort of considering banks being able to hold Bitcoin. you're starting to see more and more announcements from like investment banks that have previously stayed away from Bitcoin, now explicitly announcing like they're going to custody Bitcoin, they're going to potentially offer trading on Bitcoin and things like that. So now you're seeing you're seeing more institutional interest. It's all kind of flooding in at the same time. The people that had overwritten some of their long holdings are starting to cover their positions, and frankly, what we're hearing is that a lot of people are basically feeling like they're underinvested or feeling they're too short, these calls that they've sold. And that's kind of the catalyst. It's kind of like your typical kind of, short covering, kind of stop hunting type situation where people get kind of liquidated on the way up. So, that's kind of what we're seeing in the last few days.
Yeah, it has been an interesting couple of days out there. You mentioned what we're seeing from an overall flow perspective. I'm curious, you mentioned education earlier too. That's obviously a core focus for us here on this network. Just in general, derivatives still have a long way to go. Options have a lot of educational need just for the general investing public. Now you add that crypto layer on top of it and things get even more arcane and more obtuse out there. But it sounds like not just from the upswing, but post-halving, you're seeing a general increase in interest in the crypto derivatives across the board. Josh? Yeah,
absolutely. And I think where it's really starting to show up is, a lot of sort of hedge funds and guys that are looking at vols and have, a sophisticated view towards vols, understand that for the last few months, a lot of the surface has been underpriced. I think because of the low realized environment, especially some of the sort of 3 month, let's say the 3 month point on the curve, probably was underpriced, in the kind of high 50s, low 60 vol level. And so I think a lot of people now have started to kind of think about accumulating upside calls. The SKEW looks pretty depressed again from all that overwriting. So guys are starting to pick up some of those balls.
You keep mentioning the SKEW, and there's so much going on today. We can't bury the lead anymore. We have to keep rolling right on into our next segment. It is time for the Bitcoin Breakdown.
It's time to explore the latest trading activity, trends, and developments across the world's leading crypto market. It's time for the Bitcoin Breakdown.
All right, Josh, let's get into it. There's a lot popping off today here on the show, so we're going to roll our conversation into kind of a moving feast across all this action in the crypto space today. Because spoiler alert, listeners, there is a lot of it. We've seen Bitcoin rallying yet even as the show started. Coming into showtime, we had already seen just an impressive, some may say just overdone rally to the upside there. Bitcoin at the end of our last show is about 9,200, 9,209. Coming into today's show, we were at about 10,400. So we're already at and up about 1,200 handles. Now, as of a few minutes ago, Josh, you and I just talked it up apparently because now it's up to about 1,600 handles coming in as about 10,008, threatening 10,850 as of a few minutes ago. So over 1,600 handles to the upside over here in the past week. So a huge move after Bitcoin has kind of been languishing in a very quiet range-bound period ever since the halving. We haven't really seen a price level north of the 10,000 handle since early June, so about 2 months. And we haven't been north of this level in quite some time. I think since late last year, I think around August of last year, the 10,400 level. It's been some time since we got up to that range out there. Of course, there has been a lot of speculation as to what's driving this out there. Of course, we're seeing interest in a lot of the flight to quality assets in the broad market. We were talking about it earlier today on the option block. Gold hitting a new record high out there today as well, around 1,900, 1,941, almost 1,942, so a new record high for gold. People have speculated for a long time that Bitcoin is indeed the digital gold. We've kind of pshawed that on the show here over the past year. Maybe there's something to that of late as this recent rally. Josh, I'm sure you've heard that from a lot of your clients. What are your thoughts out there on this seemingly increasingly prevalent viewpoint, at least these days right now, that Bitcoin is indeed the digital gold, sir? Yeah.
I mean, a lot of people say that, right? That's a very common mantra. I think, the way that I've always heard it, and some of the other guys talk about it, is like it's sort of like, let's say like 1/3 gold, 2/3 tech stock, right? It's sort of like is a balance between a risk on asset and a risk off asset, depending on kind of what the macro headline is, whether it's like concerns about hyperinflation and like the Fed printing money, or concerns about growth, right? So I think, yeah, it trades a little bit by both, like both. You see, especially when it was in that range, the 9-10K range, it did kind of correlate a little bit more with stocks on a very short time horizon, I would say. But yeah, like I think now with both gold and sort of tech stocks and Nasdaq and S&P kind of hitting highs, like that's kind of the sweet spot for Bitcoin, right? Like there's no real reason for it to underperform if everything else is kind of rallying at the same time. So, one of the things that I would highlight, which is kind of a very interesting trend, is just how much money, how much rotation is pouring into Bitcoin from other assets, right? So in the crypto space. So when Bitcoin, you kind of see these cycles a lot in the market, especially in crypto, where a good proxy for this is something called Bitcoin dominance, which is basically, the ratio of Bitcoin market cap to the entire space. You kind of see a lot of this ebbs and flows in this, just depending on whether Bitcoin is an exciting thing to trade or not. If it's in a range and it's stuck for a while, you kind of see a lot of people play out further out in the risk spectrum. They'll trade more alts. They'll trade, small cap names. They'll trade. More recently, it's been a lot of movement in the DeFi kind of token space, like, Compound and Maker and some of these other sort of ETH-based protocols, decentralized finance. A lot of that has shifted back into Bitcoin. So a lot of the funds, the smaller kind of crypto funds that are very savvy in the space, have started to allocate back into the major products, Bitcoin and ETH. And that's been the big driver. Like if you look at, the assets that are really outperforming on this move, it's been primarily led by Ethereum, right? So I think even earlier this week, it was trading at 230 and now it's 320. So, nice, like 30% move, 30% plus move there. That's been the driver.
Yeah, ETH moving big as well. We'll get to that in a few minutes in the altcoin universe. Let's dive into some of those metrics you kind of alluded to earlier there out there in the Bitcoin land. Of course, all this data coming to you courtesy of our friends over there in SKEW land, SKEW.com. Check them out over there for all this data and a heck of a lot more. The realized vol, as you might imagine, looking pretty good these days. Realized, of course, listeners, is the actual volatility that's been exhibited in the marketplace over the past 30 days. It's holding firm out there. But I think let's jump to implied, because implied vol, which is, of course, the amount of volatility the market is actually pricing into current Bitcoin options. If you're out there trading Bitcoin options, you're going to trade at the implied volatility levels, and that's shot up. In fact, we had to just update it again as a few minutes ago because so much going on out there in the vol space right now. 30-day implied shooting up. Our last show, we were just shy of 50%, about 49%. Now it's up to about a 71% for that front at the money implied. So Bitcoin getting a little volatile again out there. The SKEW also reflecting that as well, reflecting this huge surge to the upside we've seen over the course of the past week. That SKEW has swung dramatically. Josh alluded to this earlier as well. It was positive. It was about plus 9.2% last show. Now this week, swinging back to the negative, to the dark side, as people want to get that upside. Minus 12%, about 12.3%. It was minus 10% when the show started. So that SKEW getting even crazier as we're looking out there. Even though the call to put net on the OI is still kind of a bit of a coin flip. Up only about slightly calls leading the dance, about 53%. Looking at open interest out here, we're seeing the OI back up at pretty much the highs, or beyond the highs, actually, what we saw back in June. Remember, people like these quarterly expiration cycles here for all things crypto. And it seems like the folks are liking it again. June came off, so that was our big high from an OI perspective. And yet, it seemed like it was going to take us a while to get the OI back to the levels where we were before. And it seems like we're back, or not quite at the June level. I think June topped out at about 1.8 billion or so net OI, but we're getting pretty close. We're north of 1.5, closing at 1.6 billion out there. So things are pretty active. Deribit at about 1.3 billion of net OI out there. Let's see. OKEX, number 2, 67 million. Ledger X, number 3, 47 million. CME, actually, I take that back. CME was number 2 at about 194 million. Then OKEX, number 3, and Ledger X, number 4. We mentioned BAKKT before. BAKKT, all their OI kind of going the way of the dodo. They're standing at a whopping 0% OI right now, 0 notional open interest. So hopefully they'll get things turned around over there at BAKKT sometime in the near future. In terms of how this OI stacks up, Deribit at about 81% still, so still the big dog in the room. CME holding firm this week at about 12%, and then we've got OKEX at 4%, Ledger X at 3%. Josh, we just unpacked a lot of data over there. You alluded to the SKEW earlier here on the show. I'm curious. It's obviously swung dramatically just over the course of the past week. Not exactly surprising given the fact that we've been pretty much all upside all the time, not the least of which today. Anything catching your eye out there from an overall vol or from a SKEW perspective recently, Josh?
Yeah, I mean, I think what you've seen from a lot of dealers is a little bit of sort of, not quite panic, but at least covering some of those upside tails. I think a lot of people had been, pretty actively selling calls on the listed markets to sort of, reduce their sort of data bills on the overriding flow that they're buying OTC. So, especially with this move higher, right? It puts people in maybe a difficult position sometimes because certainly on like Deribit and OKX and some of these other venues, when you're selling those calls, you do have to collateralize them. Make sure you're over collateralized on those venues so you don't get liquidated, which is certainly a different regime than when you trade OTC with a counterparty, that's a slower sort of margin settlement cycle. So, I think we're seeing a little bit of that, and that's kind of causing a little bit of the liquidations to the upside and sort of some of the calling getting bid up here.
Yeah, it certainly has been hard to fault people for wanting to bid up some calls. You mentioned before the overriding, having to buy some of that back, obviously driving some of that. And, of course, some of that just in general, folks, feeling the love, feeling the upside, feeling the optimism for Bitcoin. Hard to fault them when it's up 1,600 points just since our last show. Obviously, a big day over there on Deribit, 379 million worth of notional on the tape. The previous big day on our last show for the last week was about 160 million on July 17th. So well over 2x that already. And the day is far from over out there, listeners. So big prints aplenty. Let's see what some of the big prints have been so far on Deribit. Today, the big prints right now, as of a few minutes ago, it looks like about 10,000 of the 5,000 calls. These are actually on OKEX. That's interesting. So one of the bigger prints today actually coming on OKEX. OKEX is starting to light it up. I'm curious for you, Josh, and your clients over there. Deribit's obviously the big dog, but where are you putting up most of your stuff these days? Is there one venue that's dominating a lot of your flow, or are you guys kind of going wherever you can find the liquidity? Where are the big venues for you guys at Genesis right now?
I think Deribit is still sort of a preferred venue especially for people who are native to the crypto space. It's accessible to most people. I think for more regulated institutions, especially the U.S.-based guys, CME is certainly the preferred because of the fact that it's fully regulated, the fact that it's kind of transparent, and you're not really facing a smaller firm in terms of credit exposure. You're facing obviously the CME clearinghouse. So that's I think sort of a second place in terms of listed venues. And like I said, I think the majority of our flow goes through OTC. So we're not really going through a venue there. I'd say like the most interesting development in the space now is, there are big shifts going on, I think, in the market structure where there are providers coming up that are sort of looking to decentralize this sort of activity of, collecting collateral and managing it between counterparties in space. And so, that type of activity could potentially be done on chain or through sort of independent custodians and, sort of disintermediate a lot of the sort of custody aspects of collateral. So that's certainly something I think that's unique to crypto, that a lot of this stuff can be done on chain. And then I think the other big thing that's sort of, changing the way that people interact in space is these sort of platforms that are aggregating a lot of dealers and a lot of users and allowing them to sort of ask a lot of multiple dealers at the same time for pricing. So it's sort of multi-dealer platform. Obviously, more common in FX and fixed income, but it's starting to become more and more common in crypto.
Yeah, I'm just looking to parse some of the flow that's going up today. Obviously, a lot of flow hitting the tape today. Surprising amount on OKEX. I want to parse some of those 5,000 calls. Maybe that gets back to what you were talking about before, Josh. People having to buy back some of their overriding. Nearly 10,000 of those on the tape today on OKEX. It's one of the larger, in fact, the largest contract going up today across all the venues, which is kind of interesting. Deribit's all the way down there, actually number 4 with about 1,800 of the July 11,000 calls, which certainly makes sense. But OKEX getting up there. Maybe it has something to do with some contract size as well. Maybe OKEX a little bit smaller contract. Prior to today, when some of the big prints going up out there, at least on Deribit land, we had a 600 lot of the AUG 11,000 calls. Those looking pretty decent in hindsight. These went up back when on the 22nd when Bitcoin was a far in the rearview mirror, 93.75. Let's hope for this guy's sake he was buying these because those look pretty good if it's a scoop. Let's see, they went for 0.0165 Bitcoin out there, listeners. Also, we saw the July 11,500 calls and 8,000 puts in August, also active throughout the week. Saw some big 500 lots going up on Deribit on the 24th for the calls. Actually, 800 total, 500 lot and a 300 lot. When Bitcoin was about 95.5, and the puts went up in August on the 24th as well when Bitcoin was about 95.34 out there. So interesting prints out here, but I'm very curious about today's prints on OKEX. I want to dig into those a little bit as well. Heading on out to CME options, kind of a light week on the options front on CME. Not so much on the futures. They did some pretty decent paper on the futures. At least they're doing it today, but not so much on the options. Kind of a light volume week. Whoever that big whale is who's been putting up a lot of verticals in CME options, taking a break this week, maybe letting their positions do their talking for them out there. Speaking of positions, let's see where all that flow is aggregated out there right now. And it's still pretty much July, the big dog out there with about 68,000 contracts open. Once that rolls off the board, which will be fairly soon, then we should see a lot of interest out there in SEP. SEP's already coming up at number 2. It's about 32, almost 33,000 contracts. Folks just seem to like, for whatever reason, in the crypto space, they seem to like their quarterly. That's where a lot of the flow tends to aggregate. Josh, have you noticed that as well? It's kind of a bit of a phenomenon we've noted as well. Obviously, July is a bit of an outlier here, but prior to that, June had a lot more OI, about 114,000 contracts. So July's only got about half of that. So have you noticed that as well, that a lot of the flow tends to aggregate on the quarterlies and the crypto options, Josh? Yeah,
certainly. I mean, it has to do with the fact that all the kind of main futures contracts are quarterly in crypto. The sort of offshore like exchange venues, the BitMEXs and the Deribits and the Binance futures, all these guys will list the quarterly contracts, and so that's where a lot of the liquidity aggregates. And obviously, there's just not a lot of liquidity outside of the front queue contract. So basically you trade the weekly, you trade the monthly, and you trade the nearest quarterly, and that's kind of where the liquidity is.
Not a lot of liquidity on the CME options this week, like we mentioned, kind of a light week. Actually, before we get to that, let's break down the strikes as well. The 11,000 strike, we were talking about it for the last month or so, that 11,000 has been kind of dominating the tape, and it seemed like an odd choice because people just jumped right over 10,000 back when we were threatening 9,000 to the dark side there. People weren't even looking at 10,000. They were looking right at 11,000, and that maybe seems to be a prescient choice now. 19,200 open on that strike. It's far and away the number one strike out there. The next closest looks like about 10,000 with about 12,500. So folks, for whatever reason, like that 11,000 strike. Seems a lot more relevant now than it did a week ago. We could cross it by the end of the show at this rate. Heading on out to CME Bitcoin options, like we mentioned, kind of a light week. Not a lot going up. Most days, 100 contracts or less. Even if you measure by notional, it wasn't a heck of a lot. Today was one of the biggest days, about 6.1 million worth of notional, but that isn't a heck of a lot. And you know my feelings on quoting notional and crypto, listeners. Not a huge fan. On the futures front on CME land, though, they're doing a little bit more paper. Big day today. Coming into showtime, they'd already put up over 23,000 contracts. Not surprising. It's a huge day out there, huge swing out there. Last week, a little bit quieter. Every day was 8,000 or less, sometimes a lot less out there. So nothing really rivaling what we're seeing out there today. Let's head on out to the BAKKT front, see what our friend the BAKKT volume bot has to say out there. Let's see, their breakdown had about 2,567 contracts on the tape. That's actually off 36% Their all-time high member listeners was 6,601 back in December of last year. And the OI was right about 8 million. That's actually up about 15% out here. All right, we got a lot to touch on as well and some of the other segments that Josh alluded to. So without further ado, let's keep on rolling right on into the altcoin universe.
It's time to move beyond Bitcoin and find out what's moving the rest of the crypto marketplace. It's time to boldly venture into the altcoin universe.
All right, everybody, welcome to the altcoin universe, the portion of the show where we explore everything popping off outside of the world of Bitcoin. Josh, obviously ETH is a clear number 2, not just in market cap, but in the derivative space. Certainly a lot of action out there. Would you say that's the other big dog over there, Genesis? Or maybe, given what we're about to break down, the amount of action that's been out there, maybe ETH's been your number 1 recently. How is ETH shaping up relative to everything else over there these days?
Yeah, I mean, ETH has been a powerhouse, right? In the last, like I said, it's up like 30-40% in the last week. I mean, I think our view is this is sort of the market starting to price in. There's been a lot of noise around the growth of decentralized finance projects on Ethereum. And I think what you're seeing now is the sort of catch-up effect from some of the tokens and the projects and the volumes and liquidity that's available starting to flow through to kind of the underlying base protocol on which it's all built. So the token itself is enjoying a bit of a heyday in the last couple of days. I'd say it's probably a corner of the market that people were definitely, either not paying attention to or underinvested in. So I think ETH now is, top of mind for a lot of people thinking like, well, why didn't, if we're so bullish on decentralized finance, DeFi, as they call it, why wouldn't I just own the sort of the underlying, the base protocol token for ETH? And so I think that's where this flow is coming in, and a lot of people are allocating into it, and that's bled over into Bitcoin and some of the other majors as well.
Yeah, DeFi, certainly the hot trend. We've had a lot of guests on the show of late diving into that side of the space, so it's not surprising we've seen some interest in ETH. Maybe a little bit surprising that is this much interest. It has been a good run. Before we get into that, let's break down the top 10. Remember, standard caveats apply, listeners, when it comes to overall market cap numbers. Take these with a bit of a grain of salt, but the rankings, I think, are fairly reliable. Number 10, Binance Coin, back in the top 10 there, 2.8 billion out there. Number 9, Crypto.com Coin, 2.9, almost 3 billion. So our old friends, looks like a little bit of a change up in the bottom half of the top 10 there. Number 8, Litecoin, 3.3, almost 3.4 billion. Number 7, Cardano, 3.6 billion. Number 6, Bitcoin SV, 3.7 billion. Number 5, Bitcoin Cash, 4.9, almost 5 billion. Number 4, XRP, back down at the number 4 spot. People hoping maybe it could fight its way back to number 3. Not happening this week, listeners. 9.9 billion. That means number 3 is Tether, about 10 billion even. Number 2, ETH, 36 billion. Man, ETH's getting up there. And then number 1 with a bullet, of course, Bitcoin, 198, threatening the 200B level out there. That could change later on today for all we've got going on. Let's talk about ETH. ETH's been on the rampage since our last show. ETH ended our last show 238.88, coming into, as of a few minutes ago, saw ETH 323.26, up 84 handles since our last show. Just insane movement out there. Obviously, this is translating into some interesting action on the vol front, the SKEW front, the options front as well. We saw the realized vol has ticked up out there quite a bit, up to 58%. It was 44% on our last show. The implied coming into today's show has probably even increased since then. But coming into the show was up to about 82%. It's up 30 points from where it was last week. It was 52% on the show last week. ADV out in the options front also surging. It was a little bit shy of 9 million worth of notional last show. This time it's about 13 million today's show. Our biggest spike was, looks like, about 49 million. That's a huge jump from our previous shows here on the 23rd. And we also saw about almost 7.5 million going up on OKEX on that day. So you're talking about 56 million and change worth of notional combined on the 23rd from OKEX and Deribit. We saw Deribit putting up 42 million worth of notional on the 25th, 40 million on the 26th, and 35 million on the 27th. So spoiler alert, big week for ETH options. Looking back on our last show, our previous big spike was less than half of that. It was 17 million worth of notional on July 17th. So ETH options, I think the technical term is off to the races out here. We're also blowing past the recent OI levels. Remember, June was a pretty much record OI month across the board for most of the major crypto options. We hit a high of about 165 million worth of notional out there in June, blowing the doors off that right now. Combined with Deribit and OKEX, we're seeing 281 million worth of OI out there right now. So ETH options are on fire out there. Our friends over there at Genesis Volatility, they've been on the show not too long ago. They'll probably be back on again fairly soon. They've been tweeting a lot about ETH of late. So the highest all-time ETH option volume ever trading on Deribit. This was, of course, coming on the heels of that big day on the 23rd last week. And they say it has a lot of participation. Something good is happening, they say, quote unquote. I know they're big on that DeFi movement as well, so they're clearly pretty excited about that. Josh, walk us through the last week. What's it been like on the ETH front? Have the phones been lighting it up? And what have you been hearing from clients and customers? What are they up to? What do they want to do in ETH right now?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like some of the savvier guys came in before this move higher and bought calls. I think those calls, like I said earlier, look pretty cheap, right? And most of that was because of the overriding flow. I think people were picking up those balls in the kind of the mid to high 60s level. And obviously when you have like a 40% realized move in a week, that's, you pretty much covered your vol move there. So, it's been, I think a lot of those guys had exposure to the move. We've seen some folks come in to take profits on those calls that they bought, which are now deep in the money. I think another pretty interesting thing to highlight, this is obviously related to how people price calls, but can be a little bit under the radar sometimes. The forward curve has just completely blown out, not just on ETH, but on almost every asset that has forwards or synthetic kind of linear products. Most things are pricing in somewhere around, I'd say like 10 to 15% premium to spot. That's annualized premium to spot. So that sort of trade has become pretty common for a lot of the ARBs and the market makers and quant shops in the space to kind of go long or short the basis to spot across all kinds of instruments that have liquid kind of forwards. Bitcoin and ETH being the dominant ones, but that's certainly an indication of where things are and kind of the flows. Right, it just means that a lot of people are strapped for dollar funding in the space. There's just not enough dollars to go around to sort of close these ARBs. And two, it just means that a lot of people are pretty bullish, and they're all sort of positioning themselves long on synthetic instruments, and maybe because they have a shortage of cash, or maybe because it's faster and more liquid to get long, on perpetual swaps or on futures. But that's certainly something that we're all keeping an eye on. And, that sort of move, that basis move is certainly a key driver for our lending business, which, is deals in these sort of funding curves all day long.
Well, we could probably spend, and you'd certainly be warranted to spend all your time these days just on Bitcoin and ETH. There's enough going on these days, Josh, to bury your head in those two markets. But our guests come on, they always like to bring sometimes an interesting, maybe an esoteric altcoin that's not really on our radar, that's been lighting things up for them. Any interesting altcoin coming across your radar? Anybody calling you up saying, hey, I want to talk about this? Or maybe you're having to price up some synthetics or go OTC for some interesting kind of more obscure altcoin out there, Josh? Yeah,
I think we're seeing a lot more interest. I would call it in these sort of DeFi like governance tokens. I think of them as more frontier assets for people that, these assets are newly listed on exchanges. Just to name a few of them, Compound, that's COMP, Balancer, BAL, even some of the older kind of vintages like Link is another one that sort of, deals with kind of oracles for some of these protocols. All these assets are newer assets, newer vintages, and they're only now getting much more kind of prominence and traction and volumes on exchange. And so, what's interesting, I would say, across these names is that people are quoting us on a sort of hard delta replacements for in derivative space, right? So whether it's like replacing a token position with a call spread, or a token position with a risk reversal, things like that, where they're sort of altering the risk profile according to kind of what their view is on the price targets and things like that. I think more and more people are willing to position themselves in the derivative space to take advantage of weird kind of supply dislocations one way or another. And I say supply dislocations because, sometimes you have these forward curves that are very weird for some of these assets because of, let's say, like lockup schedules as these tokens get released, or specific sort of hedging flows that people have on these tokens. And so there's certainly ways to play on the forward space as well as on the vol space to kind of express views on these assets.
Interesting. A little bit of delta replacement, the old school stock substitution, but going on out here in some of these DeFi assets. It's got to be challenging, Josh, because I got to imagine the spreads on some of these, they probably want to go out at least a few months, if not 6 months or longer, on a lot of these, delta type replacement trades. It's got to be challenging getting spreads on those names that you can't drive a truck through, Josh.
Yeah. So these assets where we're structuring kind of more bespoke options, like they certainly have no visibility, right? Like it's not something where you can go look on Deribit and see where the implied vol is. A lot of the times, we're very transparent with our counterparties and we tell them, this is kind of how we're thinking about this trade, how we're pricing it. This is likely how we're going to risk manage and hedge it. We're going to be dealing primarily in the deltas and delta hedging it this way. I think people appreciate that and kind of understand, that's sort of the partnership that they have, right? Working with Genesis Trading, is that we're sort of that sell side kind of dealing desk that provides them liquidity where they really can't get it anywhere else.
I don't envy you, sir, having to source some liquidity in some of these more, shall we say, dry names out there. It's a challenge enough if you go out 6 months or a year just in Bitcoin options alone, getting decent spreads on those, let alone in some of these, shall we say, less traded DeFi products out there that don't have, like you mentioned, you can't go over to SKEW and pull up at the money implied 6 months out in some of these more esoteric tokens. Let's hit on a couple others before we roll on out of the altcoin universe, get some of your questions. Ripple, like we mentioned, back over the 20-cent level, so all you XRP bulls can exhale again, get a little bit of a sigh of relief, back over 20 cents. So don't have to worry about that one out there. We've had some guests talk about putting up some interesting OTC options prints on Ripple. It always fascinates me because it's a 20-cent name in and of itself, but there is some flow to be found apparently out there in XRP. And, of course, all the other names we're talking about up here as well, Bitcoin, SV, and others have been moving quite a bit. But I think we need to get some of you guys on the show now. Let's head on into your segment. It is time for your crypto questions.
You've got questions about crypto. Who doesn't? It's time to find out the answers to your crypto questions.
All right. Time for your questions here on the show. We know you have a lot of them, so we'll try to get to as many as we can here in the time we have remaining. Let's start off here with just Greg. Greg was listening to the show. This is the question we get a lot, particularly on the retail side here, Josh. I know that's not an area of the space you traditionally play in. You play with the more size OTC institutional players out there. But Greg wants to know, where do you even trade options on crypto? Thinkorswim doesn't offer. Yeah, this is the challenge. This is the challenge for a lot of people on the retail front to dip their toes in. They might go to a Coinbase or maybe a Kraken and look at some of the underlyings there. Options, not so much on those platforms. And, of course, adding to the challenge is the big venues we were just talking about, like your Deribits and your OKEXs and others, don't really offer a lot for the U.S. audience out here. I mean, people have asked us many times, should I go over there to trade options on Deribit? I mean, you can, but we're not going to recommend it to you because you're violating the terms of service. Sort of Damocles kind of hanging over your head. The second they discover you from a U.S. IP, they could shut you down. So it's not by any means an experience we could recommend. It's funny you mentioned the TOS platform because TD Ameritrade was looking to be more aggressive on that front. They were investing in RSX. They were seeming like they really wanted to be the lead player for retail on the derivatives front from crypto. Now, of course, all that's up in the air with the Schwab merger. So, and you're right, they don't even offer some of that stuff right now on TOS. So it is a bit of a challenge. I know, like I said, Josh, you work primarily with the large institutions, but do you have any insight to share here with our friend Greg? And I'm sure a lot of other listeners out there who have a similar question, where they can go to get some decent liquidity, some decent quoting even on options in like the retail size, the 10-lot size, Josh.
Actually, there's a venue called Ledger X, and it's actually one of the more regulated venues. I think they're regulated by the CFTC, and so and they offer their services to U.S. customers. They do kind of have a retail-focused platform that offers, I think, options on Bitcoin. So, it's something that is I think more amenable to retail flows. So, I encourage like U.S. listeners is probably the right target audience for that venue.
Yeah, we've had them on previously. They've had a lot of change up over there recently. In fact, we just had Simon Ho, who puts out their forthcoming Bitcoin VIX kind of BitVol index over there. He was just on the show last week, I believe. So talking about they're offering that, a lot to offer on the volatility front. I have to get them back on the show in this new incarnation of Ledger X, talk about what they have. Because you're right, Josh, in terms of the U.S. retail audience, they're kind of the only game in town. I've heard rumblings from OKEX and others that they're trying to make a push to try to make it more viable for that audience and set up some U.S. domicile things. But the regulatory framework here in the U.S. is still pretty dicey. So unfortunately, you don't have many choices. Ledger X might be among them. We talked about them before. They're starting to get up there in terms of overall OI and overall percentage of the flow out there. So it's not as challenging of a prospect for you guys to dive in when they weren't doing a lot of flow. And it seems like they're up to some interesting stuff. So we'll get them on the show again in the near future to pick their brains about what they have to offer for you guys out there in the retail front. Next up, we've got Ramirez. Ramirez wants to know, do you think the upcoming ETH 5th anniversary is driving all this options paper? And yeah, ETH right around their 5-year anniversary here. So it pretty much went live 5 years ago. And if the folks have been pontificating about this quite a bit, they created what they envisioned, at least what they termed a quote-unquote world computer. And they wanted it. This kind of is in keeping with a lot of the people I know who have been on the show even, who are very deep down the ETH rabbit hole. They're big believers in the transformative nature of ETH. And the people who created it thought they would have transformed not just money, but a vast range of social interactions and push the boundaries of what could be done with cryptography and distributed consensus. So a lot to unpack there. The first data point I have looking back to it was actually obviously we focus on the trading angle here. From a trading perspective, first data point I have was 66 cents back on August 10th of 2015. So from a trading perspective, we're not quite there yet on the 5-year anniversary, but pretty close. And obviously it's had a good run. It was at up over 400, almost 500% just from today's level. And of course, they hit an all-time high back in January of 2018 of 1448.18. So not quite at those levels again, but still things looking pretty good out there from an overall ETH perspective. It's at about looks like it's at about a 324, almost 325 right now. So not quite 1400, but still an interesting run. What do you think about that theory there, Josh, that it's this 5-year anniversary of ETH that's really driving this massive upswing in paper over the last few weeks, sir?
I think, possibly, right. I think there's certainly more, news coverage about ETH, and its longevity as a blockchain. I think more importantly is kind of the stuff that we talked about earlier, is the rise of, DeFi as a movement, really, as something that has gained a lot of traction in the crypto community and more broadly in the more, financial world. I think, there's a couple other sort of protocol level developments, right, that might be coming up later this year. There's sort of ETH2 and, how that's going to evolve and, improving the scalability of the protocol itself. And I think other things that might go on kind of with the underlying protocol that our people are kind of getting excited about towards the end of this summer and end of 2020. So I think all of that put together paints a pretty bullish picture for ETH.
Summer, our last comment comes in here from frequent listener Scott Somer. He chimed in before the show with a link for us to discuss. He said it was from our old friends at Zero Hedge. So take it with a large grain of salt there, listeners. But Tether's gold-backed stablecoin in demand as the commodity hits an all-time high. That was just from earlier today. Obviously, we touched on earlier in the show. Gold hitting new all-time highs, and sounds like it's doing good things for Tether's gold-backed stablecoin. Tether, of course, overall at a number 3 from a market cap there at about $10 billion. I'll have to dig into this article a little bit there, Scott, and see what's going on. It wouldn't surprise me. We've talked earlier in the show about this flight to digital quality and Bitcoin as a digital gold. Maybe Tether has the gold-backed stablecoin, so it could quite literally be the digital gold out there. Interesting stuff. We'll have to parse it up. Thanks to all of you who sent in questions and comments and the reviews on all your platforms of choice. Keep those coming because it does keep the new folks discovering the show, which is more important than ever in these crazy and tumultuous times. Of summer, our last comment comes in here from frequent listener Scott Somer. He chimed in before the show with a link for us to discuss. He said it was from our old friends at Zero Hedge. So take it with a large grain of salt there, listeners. But Tether's gold-backed stablecoin in demand as the commodity hits an all-time high. That was just from earlier today. Obviously, we touched on earlier in the show. Gold hitting new all-time highs, and sounds like it's doing good things for Tether's gold-backed stablecoin. Tether, of course, overall at a number 3 from a market cap there at about $10 billion. I'll have to dig into this article a little bit there, Scott, and see what's going on. It wouldn't surprise me. We've talked earlier in the show about this flight to digital quality and Bitcoin as a digital gold. Maybe Tether has the gold-backed stablecoin, so it could quite literally be the digital gold out there. Interesting stuff. We'll have to parse it up. Thanks to all of you who sent in questions and comments and the reviews on all your platforms of choice. Keep those coming because it does keep the new folks discovering the show, which is more important than ever in these crazy and tumultuous times. Unfortunately, that music means we've come to the end of an epic journey, and it was an epic one today, listeners. Bitcoin, ETH, off to the races out there. Looks like Bitcoin, towards the end of the show here, giving up a little bit, but only ever so slightly. Just a few ticks shy of the 10,800 level again, so after this just ridiculous, just 400 handles in the last few hours, not surprising, we give back a little bit of it. So that's where we are, ETH at about 324 and change to wrap up the show. So a lot of fun stuff on today's show. I'm looking forward to unpacking all this and your questions and comments coming up throughout the week and into our next show as well. And Josh, if folks are intrigued, they want to reach out to you over there at Genesis, maybe they're looking to price up some crazy upside in ETH or in Bitcoin or in maybe some of these newer, more esoteric DeFi tokens, where should they go? What should they do, Josh?
Please do visit us. GenesisTrading.com is our website. There's a box there that if you have an inquiry, you want to learn more about us, you can fill it in and we'll get back to you.
There you go. GenesisTrading.com is the place to go. And on behalf of Josh and indeed myself, I want to thank all of you out there for downloading, streaming, subscribing, for sending in those questions. Keep them coming. We love to hear from all of you. And we'll see you back here throughout the week. There's obviously a lot of shows on the rest of the networks. If you're just coming for the crypto rundown, A, we love you. B, you're missing out on a whole bunch of other great stuff. So make sure wherever you're listening to this, could be iTunes, could be Google Podcasts, could be YouTube, wherever you get it, make sure you upgrade to the full kit and caboodle so you can check out the whole rest of the network offerings, about a dozen shows for you. We'll be back throughout the week with all that great content, and then back again on Monday with more of the Crypto Rundown.
You're listening to the Options Insider Radio Network, the home of the Options Podcast. For more quality options programs, visit theoptionsinsider.com or search for Options Insider Radio Network in your podcast provider of choice. Listeners can also access all of our programming through our mobile app available in the iTunes and Google Play stores. Select programs are also available via live stream at mixlr.com/options-insider. That's mixlr.com/options-insider. Don't forget to follow along with your favorite programs and submit your own questions for the hosts at twitter.com/options, stocktwits.com/options, facebook.com/theoptionsinsider, or via questions@theoptionsinsider.com.